all these clips here to whoever's watching. Should we just go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you coming to watch this. My name is David Oken. I think I know all of you except for one person. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I'm sorry. What's your name?
I'm Nick.
Nick. David. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. I'm David Oken. So y'all know I work for IBM as a developer advocate. And the purpose of what I'm going to be talking about today is what it was like to develop for Swift and write Swift code without using the main tool that we all know and love/hate, for our daily jobs. And before I get into this, I wanted to say that we workshopped a couple of different titles for this talk, and I thought it would be appropriate to share some of the contenders that didn't quite make the cut, but we thought, 31 Days of Horror, why I banned Xcode for a month. We thought that was a little too clickbaity, so that one wasn't going to work. Source kit failed is something I think when we had to learn Swift we could all kind of agree with. Why code in Xcode when you don't have to? I thought would be another good candidate. I know, hilarious, right? Getting started with Eclipse, just to put the fear of God in people to make sure they know what they're getting themselves into, and to try to keep up with the times and the memes on the internet and what's popular on Netflix. Does this spark joy was also a contender for what this talk was going to be about. So what I'm going to get into today, I'm just going to kind of lay out the agenda for what we'll be covering. First, I'm going to talk about why I did this. I think that's important, and I did this on purpose, and I actually think I gained quite a bit out of it, and I'm hoping that I can share that with you. So I'll first be talking about why I did this. Then I have a confession, which you probably can figure out what that confession is, and I promise you I have a very good reason for why I did what I did. And then I'm going to talk about the alternative tools, because really this is a talk exploring some of the tools that are available for Swift development outside of Xcode, because we all know, or if you don't know, what you should know is that Xcode is a tool that you can use entirely for iOS development, and you can live in that tool and do everything you need to do for iOS and even Swift development, with some exceptions and some workarounds if you need to. But I wanted to at least cover what some of the alternatives were. Then I have a demo using server-side Swift, which actually, of the 3 demos I'm going to show, was quite frankly the easiest one to justify with this challenge that I gave myself for the month. But I didn't want to stop there, so I actually tried to explore what it was like to develop for iOS without Xcode. Hint, it's painful and bad, but it can still be done. And then, on the top, to kind of feed off the back of the confession that I'm going to make to you, I want to show what it's like to actually do debugging with low-level debugger. Without Xcode, which if you've used LLDB before, you know that it's really just a command line tool that you have in the console in Xcode. But what you may not know, and it's possible you've worked with it, but you may not know that it's a fully fledged command line tool that can be used completely independently of Xcode. And what you have to keep in mind is that all these different tools that we're going to talk about and all the different things that Xcode really runs on are really just all command line tools that are being bundled together in a UI. And LLDB is no exception here. So we'll be talking about that as we go today. And then I'm going to talk about what I took away from this month and what I can share with you. So I decided that I was going to do this, and I decided I was going to do it in January because, well, everybody talks about New Year's resolutions and growing as a person and trying to do something in a new year. And I thought back to times earlier in my career where I was on contract site and I was asked to do something, and they would leave the room and I would say, okay, I'm going to get on Google or Stack Overflow and figure out, how do I do this thing? How do I connect to a web service? How do I parse JSON? How do I do things that might seem easy to us now if we have some experience, but you have to remember that things that seem brainless to you now, there was once a time where you just didn't know how to do it. And different people have different ways of approaching different problems. I myself have found that I've encountered a lot of anxiety in my career, like real actual physical anxiety, when trying to be confronted with the problem of how do I do something new. And so I thought, now that I feel like I have a little bit more experience under my belt, and I've been in situations where I can work my way out of, kind of a pickle or something like that, I figured that, this discomfort is going to yield something different for me. And so I thought, okay, let's give myself this challenge. Let's see what I can learn from it. and let's see what I can share with other people and give back to the community with. Additionally, it's interesting because my position is such that I'm an advocate for Swift on the server for IBM, and it is possible to write an entire book on the topic without using Xcode once. Spoiler alert for a project that I may have worked on earlier, I did use Xcode quite a bit, and I'll get into that a little bit later on, but it is possible to develop in server-side Swift without Xcode entirely. In fact, the reason I even work for IBM was due to a presentation I saw at WWDC by a pair of IBM employees. And what was so crazy about their talk was they wrote a Swift server in VI, deployed it on the command line, and used an iOS app simulator on a different laptop to show that it was working. And that blew my mind, and that really inspired me. So I thought about that a lot as I got started this month, and then I decided that I was going to give that a shot. So that's ultimately the why. There's other reasons so far as proving the tools that are out there, kicking the tires on them, and I like being that guy. The actual Kitura core team views me as their friend that takes what they've built and I dog food it, and I see if it actually works. And there have been times when I've come back to them and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this, or hey, this is really good, or you know what would be really good if we could do this. And so I'm hoping that whatever voice this provides is something that can give back to the community and say, hey, I actually used this for a month, some of these bleeding edge tools, and they really work, or this needs to change, etc. So I'm hoping that can affect change in some way. So my confession that I made. Can anybody here predict what my confession is after not using Xcode for a month, or proposing that I did not use Xcode for a month? Does anyone want to take a guess as to what I have to confess to all of you? I figured I'd get this out of the way early to avoid like suspense or anything or being facetious, but
well, you just hinted at it. I think you did use it sometime.
I have to confess that I did use Xcode one day out of it, and I'm going to explain what the situation was. So I do have a full-time job, and that full-time job involves writing code for apps that are in production and downloadable on the App Store. And in the middle of January, one of my coworkers, who shall remain nameless, said to me, hey, David, that app that we worked on last summer, so I have this bug with it. And I thought, cool, this is really going to test me, and I'm going to really put into practice what I said that I was going to do, and let's see what we can do. It has to do with video streaming, the bug, and I thought, okay, really going to be difficult to debug. I think I might run into some problems here, but I'm still going to see what happens. And I'm pretty sure it's a multi-threading problem, is what he said. And I thought, I'm really sorry, I can't. Yeah. When you talk about, and when he showed me the bug and showed me what was happening, and I just thought, okay, I have to do it. I have to still continue to earn my paycheck. I still have to, put food in front of my family and everything. But in all seriousness, I did for this particular use case, I did use Xcode, but I did take a look into, well, is it possible to still have debugged that problem? Which, by the way, that bug is now still an open issue on the Watson SDK. So it was a real nasty one that we have found out about. But I wanted to think, would it have been possible to debug this without Xcode? And the answer is yes. And I want to try to pimp out one of my coworkers' books. So when I say coworker, I also write for RayWenderlich.com. And Derek Sellender wrote this book about Apple debugging and reverse engineering. And this is a crash course in LLDB. I really strongly recommend this book, if nothing else, because when you do some of the stuff in this chapters, you feel like you're either in The Matrix or in Swordfish or whatever one of those movies are where you feel like a cool hacker or something like that. But this additionally really opens your eyes into some of the stuff that you get from like what really actually comprises the environment that, frankly, I learned from this month that we kind of take for granted. So I really recommend this book. I strongly recommend this book, and I think that you should take it because the multi-threading issue, in theory, could have been debugged with some of the practices out of this book. I told myself when I was done using Xcode that one day that I'm going to try to see if I can circle back and do it to kind of atone for my sin, so to speak. I did not have the time. I have a cold right now, so please go easy on me as well. But I do plan to at some point because now the bug's been logged, we know kind of what's going on, and I do believe that the answers are in this book. So just wanted to recommend this again, Advanced Apple Debugging and Reverse Engineering. So what are some of the alternative tools that we have available to us? I want to talk about what's available, and I'm going to be honest right now that I did not use all of these throughout my month. The first one is Xcode, made by a company named JetBrains, which is great. JetBrains makes a lot of really interesting tools. I have a subscription to WebStorm for JavaScript development right now. I've used IntelliJ for Java development before when I tried to poke around an Android app, and IntelliJ does really good stuff with C++ as well. But JetBrains generally make really, really good products. And Xcode is no exception to that. And I've had a lot of people respond to the tweet about this talk by saying, why would you ever go back to Xcode after using Xcode once? And I thought, well, frankly, Xcode relies on Xcode build to get it done. And you have to open some things in Xcode in order to get it done. So I didn't use Xcode that much for this because it's assumed that it's an actual proper integrated development environment. So I didn't really go into Xcode that much with this. There's also a tool called Swift Studio, which my friend Marcin Kurzanowski worked on, and I'm going to play a video by him later, but it's something that he has devoted his full-time strength to work on as an alternative IDE to Xcode. I know I've chatted with a couple people on the Xcode development team at Apple, and none of this is meant to disparage the work that they do. In fact, this work will amplify the awesomeness of what they do, but I think having a challenger in the arena is a really healthy thing for kind of the status quo. And I think what Marcin's doing with Swift Studio is a really good example of that. So I'm going to recommend you check out what he's got. Katura Studio, actually, as well, there's also a tool that the Katura team released which allows you to have an integrated development environment for developing an Xcode, for developing Katura servers. And it's got integrated Docker support, etc. I'll talk about the stuff that my job requires me to talk about in just a minute. But the two main things that I wanted to get into was Visual Studio Code, because there's a lot of impressive buzz around Visual Studio Code and the tool that exists there. And then I wanted to go old school with the command line. I've gotten really used to the terminal in my career as a software developer, and I feel almost more comfortable on the terminal than I do in the GUI sometimes. So I wanted to really see how much you can push that in some of the tools that you have around that. So let's go through that one time. Like I said, I didn't really use Xcode that much, so I'm just going to say it's a great tool. I recommend getting it if you're looking to kind of get away from Xcode. There's a lot of really good text editing tools that exist in Xcode that really kind of push the needle. And they say that, oh, Xcode is going to Sherlock a bunch of features that come out in third-party tools and things like that. But it really is the community that's motivating the people that work on Xcode and these other Apple tools that we use a lot to make these things work. So that's one thing that you can do. And then Swift Studio, again, this is a video that Marcin made, so I'm just going to play that for you.
Hi, hello. My name is Marcin Krzyżanowski. I'm author of Swift Studio, the IDE that is still in development. I was not able to make a beta for this meeting, although it's almost ready. And I encourage you to go and check out swiftstudio.app, where you can sign up for a beta. But what is Swift Studio? Swift Studio is basically the best Swift IDE you can imagine, partially because it's still not existent, partially because this is how I imagine it will be. The beta is expected soon. I hope to launch something by the March. For now, you can see teasers on Twitter. I post them regularly. You can see some features I'm working on, like Docker support, and some cool stuff for Swift on server, because this is the main focus in chapter 1. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and see ya. I'm going back skiing. Bye.
So when I say that he recorded this video for this meetup, I messaged him on Slack, and he literally called me back between runs on the ski slopes, and he went in and recorded this video. He's sending some stickers over our way, so if you want a sticker, come to my other meetup. We meet every Thursday at Ben U, right over on Congress and Riverside, is it? Yeah, Riverside. I always get Barton Springs, Riverside. I think I'm moving down more south in the summer, but we'll see. But come hang out with us every Thursday. This is just another plug for our other meetup group. We're there every Thursday, and at a future meetup, I will have stickers for Swift Studio. in the future. So please come check it out. But this is to say that you can't really test software that doesn't exist, no matter how awesome it is, even in theory. So I recommend you check out what Marcin's going to work on. You can go to that app and sign up to be part of the beta. But you can also try out some of his other stuff. So swiftplayground.run, which is basically an online Swift playground that, by the way, runs on IBM Cloud, if I say so myself, in Kubernetes. But Marcin's a really great open source developer. He gives quite a bit back to the Swift community, and I recommend checking out what he's got. Now, Katura Studio, just so you know, it was modeled after Eclipse, and it eliminates the need for a command line. And we worked with a team called Xcode that are currently working on an alternate Swift IDE as it is right now. But they've released something with us called Katura Studio, which is going to be available, and you can go to the website. And I want to make sure you know that I'm not influencing you to actually download this tool or anything like that, so feel free to try it out if you want. My job doesn't depend on it or anything like that. It's not like anybody's watching this and is going to decide whether or not I'm doing my job if you download this, but I recommend you give this a shot if you'd like to. This is what it looks like. So if you've used Eclipse, it should look similar to you, but the really nice thing about this tool is the things that the commands that you would usually have to type into your command line to get a server running in Docker so that you could test it in Linux. That's all built in for you into the IDE. Running with Swift Package Manager support is also built in for you. I'm not going to cover this too much because, again, this is really an example of another integrated development environment, and I wanted to show more nuts and bolts about what is really available to you. So I recommend you check this out, see what it's like, but I'm not going to do too much of a demo of that. I really want to dive into Visual Studio Code because it's a really exciting tool that they've built. And what's really interesting about it is that there's tons of community support around Visual Studio Code now. So just about every programming language has plugin support built in for it, and Swift is no exception to that. What's also cool about it is, I don't want to sound like superior to anybody or anything, but the first time I ever tried software development was when I was in high school, and it was C++, and it was all from the command line, and you had to constantly type the build command, and it was all just standard in, standard out, printing things like that. And so having the integrated terminal reminds me of that. It takes me back to my roots. Now for Swift on the server development, this is an ideal scenario because instead of having to switch back and forth between your text editor and where you're typing all your routers and everything, and then going back to your terminal and typing your commands and building things, running your executable, checking your logs, etc., to be able to do it all in one screen is one of the first things that it jumps out to you when you're trying to do Swift on the server development or any kind of non-iOS development for Swift. And so that's what's really cool about having that. But the real interesting thing that surprised me when I was working through this month was LSP support. Now, the language server protocol, I'm really glad that I didn't put animations on these bullet points, but whatever. The language server protocol, who here has heard of the language server protocol so far? Couple of us, okay. When we make a protocol in a Swift object, we know that you can define certain objects or certain properties that an object must conform to, okay? Think of this in the same way that you're going to have a server that is going to administer tips and tricks and compiler time directives about a certain language. And this is a protocol that is designed to fit any programming language into how your text editor would communicate with that language server. So language server protocol is actually mainly supported by Microsoft, and they're purporting it out as an open standard for modern programming languages. Swift recently announced an integration with the language server protocol, and it's pretty cool, and Visual Studio Code is a great example of it. Matt Thompson, the guy who wrote Allen with Fire and AF Networking, he's got a great article on NS Hipster. Now that he doesn't work for Apple, he can speak freely in public now. But he's got a great article on NS Hipster to talk about how you can integrate the language server protocol with Visual Studio Code. And seeing that article and trying that was one of the main mitigating factors in deciding to try this for a month. Because in some ways, I actually thought it was better than Xcode in terms of showing the errors that I was having, auto-completion, etc. So let's talk about what language server protocol actually looks like. So again, we've talked about your development tool, which in this case is just Visual Studio Code, and it uses JSON RPC, remote procedure control, remote procedure commands. RPC, I forget which one it is, but it uses standard language to communicate between the tool that you're using and the server that's been set up. So all you have to do is run an instance of SourceKit on your machine that ties into the language server protocol, and then any IDE that you set up to basically speak out to that protocol is going to work with it. So when you open a document, the language server can then take in examples to say, hey, in this file, you need to color your syntax this way. When you make an edit on a certain file, you can say, okay, this is what you're going to need to change. These are auto-completion suggestions that we can send back. And because this is all happening on your machine, that shows you how quickly this can run back and forth. So an example is, let's say that I'm in a Visual Studio Code playground, and I'm on the file that, use.cpp, which is a C++ file, which is to say, yes, this even works for languages like C++. And let's say that I'm clicking on line 3, character 12, and I'm clicking the jump to definition button in Visual Studio Code, which in Xcode we know that you hold command and you click on something, and that usually will pop up the definition of a particular function or a method, or it'll give you information about that parameter and take you to its root type and take you there. And what's happening when you do that with Language Server Protocol is you're actually sending this JSON request to that server, and your server will respond saying, okay, this is where it starts, this is where it ends, and this is the file that you want to reference to give information about the class provide.cpp. So what this means is you can actually, if you wanted to somehow write your own programming language, you could then write an LSP around that to show how this works and to be able to set up a server to act however you want it to. So you could, in theory, take the open source LSP that exists for Swift right now, fork it, configure it to your liking, and give you certain things based on whatever you click for it. So the LSP has become, oh, sorry, typo. The LSP has become pretty great. Drugs are, interesting, kids. The LSP is starting to become pretty magical. And what I found in working with it was that there were often times where whenever you have to build an Xcode project and wait for all your dependencies to build in, or if you've got most of your libraries built in underneath and you're just checking in changes or something like that, you usually have to wait a couple of seconds to get back an error. There were often times in Visual Studio Code where I would hit a typo and literally the error would be immediate upon seeing that typo. Similarly, you don't quite get the autocomplete and some of the function features out of the LSP that you're kind of used to using with Xcode. So there's a give and a take there, but some of the features that it did give me were really promising. So before I get into that, I want to just talk about the command line for a bit. If anyone ever tries to lord over you by saying that VI is a superior text editor, don't listen to them. I'm going to use VI in this demo that I'm going to show y'all today. It's because I am trying to make myself more comfortable with it over time, but that is not by any means me trying to say, look at how much better of a developer I am than you, look at how much smarter I am than you. I have spoken with people like that and I want to slap them in the face. Don't worry about people like that, but the reason I want to use VI in this context is because it goes to show that you can open a terminal and develop on your entire stack and debug on your entire stack all from one environment. And I think that's kind of one of the benefits of VI. So it does have its benefits if you want to try to learn how to write in VI as a text editor, but you don't have to use it. This is extensible to any text editor that you want. So if you use Sublime Text or Atom or anything else, you can use that. I'm choosing to use VI because it's right integrated into the terminal. But when you think about the tools, and this really gets into some of the work that you do with iOS, when you think about that, you have to use a tool called Xcode build, which if you've ever set up CI tests on Travis or Jenkins or anything like that, you're probably familiar with this command to manually set up a build of your command. And I got through doing all this, and I thought it was great that I got the simulator running from the command line. Oh, this is cool. But then I thought, the name Xcode is in the command. Is this Xcode? Is it possible to use Xcode build without truly having Xcode? And there's some hacky things that you can download that will work for Xcode build. Like you can actually get a version of Xcode build that will compile on Linux, and so that means you can do some real kind of rooted iOS development on Linux if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend it if you're trying to get onto the App Store, but that is a thing that you can do. So be aware of its existence, but it's not like a main thing that you have to do. So let's just go ahead and dive into some demos now. And I think it'll be important to start by saying that server-side Swift really is kind of the logical first step for this, because it's the easiest thing to demonstrate without having to use Xcode, because again, at its inception, Xcode was kind of extra sugar thrown on top of it as far as like what you could do with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal, and I'm just going to open up a project that I have ready to go here, but I'm going to open it up with Visual Studio Code. So let's check and see where I am here. So I'm in this project. This is an upcoming tutorial that I'm updating for raywenderlich.com for a reason that you will hopefully find out about very, very soon. And what I'm going to do here is you can see that I've got my package.swift file. So if I print that out, you can see what all my dependencies are and everything like that. So if I were to type swift build, because I've already built this and I don't want to rely on an internet connection for the server, I can go ahead and just have everything ready. And what you're used to, and I bet you didn't know this, is if you have an Xcode project already available in your command line at the current context that you're at, a cool little trick that you can do is xed and then dot, which is to say in the current directory, use xed to open whatever Xcode file is available, or you can specify an Xcode file there if you want. But instead of that, what Visual Studio Code provides you is you can type code, and what it will do is it will open up an instance of Visual Studio Code with everything right there for you. And I want to show you around some of this. So my Visual Studio Code is very, very heavily modded to the way that I like it. I'm very happy with this, but I want to show you what you have available. So notice here that I've got the Swift language server protocol running at all times on my machine. So if I was going to go here and I command click on this, or if I sort of highlight that, it should pop up, but of course because this is a live demonstration it doesn't quite work. But you can see some of the things that we get with autocomplete. So if I'm going to say let acronyms equals documents, there we go. And you can see here that you can see all the different functions that I have on top of that. So it should show up, and because I'm streaming it might take an extra second, but you can see here that the extra function I've got is decode documents, and it should be able to fill in the types that I've got for me there as well. But I'm going to leave this here, and what I want to show you is just what this works with. So this main.swift function, as you know from working with any modern programming language, this is the first thing that runs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run an instance of app, which is defined for me inside application. So now you can see if I just hover over a class, it's going to tell me what that class is. So if I go to application and scroll down, let's go over router. And if I just hover over router for a second, let's see, post init, or I can do CouchDB client, a couple different things. I digress. Let's just get into it. So what it's going to do is it's going to set up this router. It's going to instantiate a connection to a database that I have running on my machine. And I can type all of this stuff. So I can say, if error, I'm just going to retype something that I've already typed here. So if I want to say guard let database equals database else. So now here's something I can actually demonstrate to you. So you see that I've got else here. Now notice this problems number that I've got right here. So notice that it's only 1 right now. But if I typo that, it's going to come up with 2 right away, and it's going to say expected else after guard condition. Now we know that this is usually an error that we see after building and running our app, and we're going to say, oh yeah, I flubbed up something there, or usually it'll come up in a couple of seconds because SourceKit will compile that on Xcode for us right away, and it'll show us that we've got an error right there. But instead, the second I type the E, it disappears right away. So that's how fast the LSP can be in terms of communicating issues back and forth. And what's nice about Visual Studio Code is this is a tool developed by Microsoft and the community, but really headed up by Microsoft, and yet that's native problems solving for you right there in a pane that they've got. And then I can just go over here to my terminal and actually start doing stuff with this. So I'm going to delete what I've got here, and then I'm going to type swift build one more time. And notice that this command line that I've got right here is nothing more than just what I've originally been working with. So if I want to build and run my app with Swift Package Manager now, what I have to do is type, go to my build folder, and I can select debug, and I can go to my executable and run that. And again, all the logs that I would usually see from running a web server inside Visual Studio Code, if I wanted to go to my command line, I've got that right here. So now what I can do is I can even set up a new tab on my command line, and I can use curl commands to work with that particular server. So I can go back and forth. So tab number 1 over here is going to be my logs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, let's curl my main endpoint, which is just going to be curl http localhost 8080 acronyms. And it'll give me back whatever I have in the database that I've saved for the previous tutorials. But you can see here, it received a get type safe request. I added a print statement there that I'm going to show you what that's for later. But again, notice that I'm doing full stack Swift development right here on a server, and I'm staying in one window. That's what Xcode is designed to do for iOS development, and it's cool to see that you can do this. Some examples of projects is there was a Trello integration I wrote for Slack, and I did the whole thing entirely in Xcode. I wish I could open source it, but it's not meant for public eyes. But I remember at one of the weird Swift meetups, I did the entire thing in Visual Studio Code. You can create an entire project from scratch from the terminal, right here in the integrated terminal, and the File Explorer will open it up right here. So the stack that we have available to us is actually pretty cool, and it's exciting to see what it works with. And yet, I still found myself running into errors and having to literally take a second, breathe, and read the error to understand what it was, because we're used to getting those autocompletes in Xcode. So for example, when you don't quite have a nil coalescing operator set the way that it should be, you know how you can click that triangle with the button to be able to fill in the double question mark and then nil, so you can coalesce to nil if you're not setting that up right, or set up your optionals correctly if you're not working with that. You don't get that in Visual Studio Code, and you have to actually read the errors and interpret what it's saying and then act appropriately. So I do think that working with Visual Studio Code and forcing yourself to stick in this environment can make you better, because you're actually going to understand what you're doing. Because sometimes it's easy to get lazy when you're working with Xcode and just say, yeah, just fill it in. Let me click what that's telling me to do. Let me just take care of that and just figure it out later. But the truth is, we never really go back to it and figure it out later. So it's easier, it's better for you, I think, when you're working with this stuff, write all in an environment and you actually have to read the error, interpret it, and act appropriately. You don't get a whole lot of autocomplete. That being said, with the language server protocol, who knows how that's going to change in the future, and it's exciting to see. So that's a very brief example of server-side development with Swift. I'm going to cancel that, and I might have accidentally left that going, but we'll find out later on. We should be able to work with that. So we used Visual Studio Code for that, and I think it's pretty exciting to see what's coming out of that. And I think it's pretty exciting to see how easy it is to actually develop real working Swift code in that. But server-side Swift, again, is kind of an easy, low-hanging fruit to work with this. So I think really, what's it like to do proper iOS development with Swift? And the tool we're going to use for this is nothing more than the command line and Xcode build. So in order to do this, we're going to go back to the command line here, and I'm going to go to another demo that I have here. Okay, now this is a demo of an iOS app I have that I worked with Realm on, just to kind of demonstrate how you can have a Realm object server deployed to the cloud with a couple of different things. But this should just be a simple iOS app, and if this works appropriately, which I had to restart my computer before this, so I'm just going to say now, I hope this works. You've seen me get it working before, so I'm hoping that this works the way it does. But if not, I can show you, what those commands are, and I'll share that after the presentation. Nonetheless, what you can do in order to do that, so obviously you don't need these Xcode projects and these XC workspaces to work with that. If you wanted to, all you got to do, so let's see, if we go into services, we look at Foursquare or Realm. If we want to go into realm.swift, or no, we want to VI that. So right here inside this text editor, I'm going through here, and if I want to make a change to something, it's just a text editor. There's nothing stopping me from doing that. I'm not going to change anything for the sake of this demonstration, but I just want to show you that you do have a full-fledged text editor right in front of you. Now, when you're using VI, you don't have a lot of the stuff that the language server protocol is going to give you, and that's why you have things like Visual Studio Code to kind of give you that real-time feedback and kind of give you an idea to work out what it is that you're working on. But you can do that sort of thing, and I wanted to show you that you could. But we're going to go back out to the root directory here. And so how would you load an executable app that you build from the command line onto an iOS simulator? And technically, yes, we have to use Xcode build to do this, which if we're really keeping score at home, yes, technically you need Xcode in order to run Xcode build, but can we do this outside of Xcode? And the answer is yes, that we can. So we're going to type Xcode build, and we're going to specify a couple things. So now Xcode build, by the way, is a very, very well-documented command line tool with a lot of settings that you have available to you. It's actually kind of fun to play with, and one benefit of working with Xcode build on the command line is that if you ever need to be that person that sets up CI and CD for your company, continuous delivery and continuous integration, Xcode build is going to be the tool that you use. Facebook, a couple of years ago, they had released something called XC tool. It's since been deprecated because of some of the changes to Xcode build, but that was also kind of a more convenient command line tool wrapper around Xcode build. It's interesting to see what people work with in the future, but Xcode build is still the de facto here. So what is the command going to look like that we need to run here? Well, we're going to run, as we said, Xcode build, and what you can do is you can specify a workspace. So I'm going to say Realm Cloud Functions Demo XC Workspace. And then for the scheme, we want to make sure that we're specifying the scheme that runs the actual app so that we can choose that build and run command to deliver an executable to the right place. So I'm going to type scheme, and we know that Realm Cloud Functions Demo is the right scheme here. And then for the SDK, we're going to choose iPhone Simulator. Spelled that right? Yeah, 12.1. And then after that, I'm going to type build. I could append -- release to this if I want to build it for release, if I wanted to do that. If I wanted to write test, then build, what it would do is it would run all the unit tests if I had any. Don't tell anybody, I didn't write unit tests for this app. This was just a POC. But you could write test, then build if you wanted to get that going. But we're going to run this, and this is going to look really verbose if you're used to seeing what you get kind of out of Xcode build from the UI of Xcode. But this is just going to show us that all the different objects that our app is creating, it's going to go through that process of getting everything ready for us. And then we're going to have an executable that's built and delivered to our derived data folder, which we're so used to clearing out. And the reason you're used to clearing that out is because you're cleaning up the last build that you created so that you can create something fresh. So that's what this is going to create. And then we're going to use some other commands to actually get our simulator running. And we're going to deploy that executable to the simulator from the command line that we've got. And then we're going to boot the simulator up all from the command line. So this should be done in just a minute. And this is a totally open source framework. This is a totally open, let's see here. So build succeeded is of course delivered in white. Build succeeded, great. So we're in good shape. That was some suspense right there. All right. So now what we want to do is we can use a tool called SimCTL to list all of the different simulator devices that we have available on our machine. These simulators were created by Xcode, but that's not important right now. We're going to type xcrun simctl list. And what we're going to get is we're going to get a bunch of descriptions, but most importantly, we're going to get a bunch of GUIDs that are associated with those devices, so we can use that a bit easier. So if we go through here, if you've scrolled through the simulators you have available in Xcode, this should look familiar to you. But what we're going to do is we're going to specifically run the iPhone XS that we've got here. And so, no, actually, you know what? I'm going to run the XS Max. Why not? Let's tempt fate. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that GUID. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type xcrun instruments -w. And I'm just going to go ahead and run that. Now what this is going to do is this is going to kind of trick the simulator into booting, thinking that we're going to be running like a profiler on this. But it's saying that we haven't specified a template for what type of profiling we're going to run on it. But in the background, you'll notice that we got our simulator up and running. So we're going to wait until this finishes booting. And you're going to notice that we don't have this app. Not that you would know what the app icon looks like, but I can tell you certainly that we don't have the app loaded onto the simulator yet. How can we get that on there? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to, let's see here, we're going to run xcrun simctl install booted. And notice that for booted here, we could use the GUID that we've identified our simulator device with, but once you get it in a context where it's just running one device, you can simply use booted, and SimCTL will know to go to the only default device that's been booted. So we're going to use that here, and I'm going to say users, David Oken IBM, library, developer. Yes, I wrote this down before the presentation, so I wouldn't mess it up. Derived data. Let's see, Realm, Cloud Functions Demo. And let's see, our choices are going to be, let's go with this different one, GTBX. Yep, let's go with that one. And we're going to get into our executable here. So we're going to build products debug iPhone simulator realm the cloud functions demo app. So if this works appropriately, this command should install that app right onto it. And of course it fails because it's not working. So we're going to try to do the other one because I think we used the wrong plist. So let's try that one more time. Xcrun simctl install booted users David Oken or IBM. Just a second. Library developer Xcode drive data. Let's use the one that we already know works. So azyn build products debug iPhone simulator realm cloud functions demo app. Hey, that works a little bit better. So notice that we've now installed something to our simulator all from the command line. Now, I could just move my mouse and tap the icon on the simulator, but I'm very hard-headed and stubborn, so I want to show you how you can even do that with a command line. So we're going to type this command, which is xcrun simctl launch booted com IBM realm cloud functions demo, which if you're used to that, that means that that is going to be your bundle identifier for the app. And boy, I hope this works. If we run that, there we go. We've booted our demo app. Now, the service for this isn't hooked up to the right server. I could have done that if I wanted to check and see that I had a service running and everything, but you'll notice that core location is working fine. And now I have full use of my simulator, and we didn't even have to open Xcode to completely build an app from scratch, install it to a specific simulator that we chose how to do, and yeah, we could even push the start button from the command line if we wanted to. Of course, if I wanted to, I could just go back and push it on the simulator and that would load it up just fine. But again, this is just to show you what's possible with the simctl tool. Again, Matt Thompson from NS Hipster wrote a really good article on simctl, and I recommend you check that out as well. So that's how you can do some iOS development, all from the command line and a text editor. But let's go back to that initial use case where I had to confess that I used Xcode once, and that's talking about having to do some actual debugging without Xcode. And we all, if you've done any iOS development, you've likely figured out how to set up breakpoints and be able to drag them and step through them. You even might know how to use the PO command on LLDB inside your Xcode console. Well, I'm going to show you how you can do pretty much most of those things all from the terminal. Now, in truth, you can do all of these things from the command line. If you must know, I didn't have very much time to put together this part of the presentation, so the last couple of days have been spent just kind of mucking around with this. So what I'm going to show you has been learned fairly recently, but this is something that I can get into and show you how this works all from a Swift on the server application. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and clear my console, and I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back to that Ray Wenderlich app that I was working on. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and build this application, if I type it right. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is, just like any debugger that you work with in any other programming language, you can actually run an entire executable from inside the debugger, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to type LLDB, and we're in. Now, if I type help, it's going to give you all the instructions that you might need to understand how you want to use LLDB all from here. Now, there also is a translation, so if you're used to using GDB, if you're compiling on GCC, there's a list of translations from commands that you might be used to using with GDB to go over to LLDB. If that's your thing, I'm going to give you a link at the end of this presentation to show you how you can translate those commands and use them in LLDB. But we're going to step through this, and what I'm going to do, the first thing is you need to attach LLDB to a specific executable that it's going to examine. Because if I just type run right now, it'll say invalid target, we haven't set something to debug on. So you have to manually set the executable. Because I ran Swift build on my app, which I don't know if I did, so let me just do that once more, just to be sure. Okay, and we'll type LLDB once more. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna say target create. And the nice thing about LLDB is you get autocomplete just like you would expect in the terminal. So it'll say available completions. I actually think this autocomplete is kind of nice compared to what you usually get in terminal. So I'm going to go into where that executable is stored. It's going to be in my hidden build folder, and we can go into debug. And we're going to find my Katura TIL, which is the name of the application I'm working on. So we're going to say Katura TIL. And what's interesting about the target create command is you can specify a couple different things. So notice that it was able to infer that we're running on a 64-bit architecture right now. If you've built that particular application for a different architecture, such as the simulator, which is i386 or something, or you've got another architecture inside a container or something, you can put in a flag that will choose to build it for a different architecture and attach it to that. But you can, make that choice, and LLDB will infer that for you. So we've attached it to a target, and if I wanted to, I could run the app, but it's just going to crash because it's just an ongoing process that's going to happen on a run loop. That's what a Katura server is anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint on main, and what that's going to do is that's going to give me a breakpoint whenever the main.swift file is executed. So I can even say blist, and it's going to say, yep, this is the memory address where we're going to set a breakpoint, and this is where we're going to get into as soon as we activate that. So now, if I type run, cool. Password is Xcode sucks 123, just kidding. So now you can see though, is because we set that breakpoint, notice that beneath all my import statements, the first line of code that I have inside main.swift is helium logger use. And it's set a breakpoint for me right there. It's showing me the code that I'm at, and it's giving me the memory address. And so if I had something that I wanted to print out, I could, but I haven't even instantiated a single thing inside my application scope yet. So what if I want to see what helium logger does? Well, I can type step, and it'll take me into what that function actually does. So you can see here that that function is going to run, use the type, and you're going to see that even type, if I'm not specifying it, because you'll notice here I didn't pass a parameter inside use, so it's going to say that my default type is going to be verbose. So what if I want to see what that actually looks like and print that out? Well, if I step, you know that any time it's going to try to cycle through all the parameters with LLDB. So the first step is just going to go back out to the scope that goes into that. But if we step into it again, now we're back here, and just like you would do with LLDB inside Xcode, if you're saying, okay, my parameter is type, what is that? Well, if I do PO type, it's going to print out verbose for me. We've done this. If we've worked in Xcode long enough and you've gotten to the point where you've printed out local variables inside the console, this is what you're doing as well. But let's say, instead of stepping into this, because I don't really want to specify, go into the log or anything, what if I just want to go to the next line? Well, I can type next. And I can just keep on going like that. So now I'm going to go ahead and step and just keep on going until I get back out to a context I'm comfortable with. Okay, and then so I can say, okay, let's go to the next line and let app equal app. What if I want to take a look at what that looks like? Well, now it's taking me into the actual application class that I've written, where I'm setting up my CouchDB client. I'm setting up my database, I'm setting up my router, and you're noticing that you're just stepping through an application the same way that you would in Xcode if you wanted to. So what if I want to actually set a breakpoint on a print statement? Now this is where the magic ends, but I'm going to say b swift.print, because remember that the namespace for print is going to be on top of Swift. So if you wanted to do like sort by a certain array function that it's got, you would then type Swift array sort. And you have to namespace things properly. You can even do this for your own functions if you want, but I just want to demonstrate what this looks like. So I'm going to set a breakpoint there, and you'll notice that in this local context, it's found 4 locations where I'm printing something to say, connection to database succeeded or something like that. So we can see what happens if I run. So I'm going to type C for continue, and it's just going to go right up to the point where we get to a print statement, and this is where I still have more to learn, but you can see that we found an instance of this. It shows me exactly where it is, and I can get right to it. And it stopped the application, but this is where some of this goes, and I recommend playing with this. I'll show you a web page where you've got all these commands available to you. However, this is where you can actually set up things like breakpoints on top of dispatch queue. So if I really wanted to go into that multi-threading issue, I could set up a symbolic breakpoint on dispatch queue wherever I'm synchronizing to the main thread or another global thread where there might be a race condition that I'm not expecting. And if I wanted to, I could do this all from the command line. I think we all agree that we don't want to, but you could, and that's what this is meant to show you, because once people realize that you can, you start to appreciate the tools that you have available to you a little better. And I think if you get used to working with some of this, you might actually feel a little bit more powerful using the tools that you have available to you. So that's a demo of how you can use LLDB on the command line. So what did I take away from this? Because I had to do this for a whole month, and I'm not kidding when I say that February 1st I flew back from a work trip, and a tutorial that I was working on in Visual Studio Code the day before, I opened Xcode up right away the next day because it wasn't January anymore, and I decided to keep working on it in Xcode. What was the biggest takeaway though was, and I experienced this a lot when I was at my own meetup, is you actually feel real fear that manifests itself in shortness of breath, sweat, or it's funny, but it's also entirely true. And this happens a lot when you're working in an environment that you're not comfortable with. And it's a big problem. The key element, and this is what I had to take away from this, is that there is a solution to this fear. And don't let anybody make you feel bad for feeling this fear. Like, I didn't study computer science in college, and I don't think that I had to, because I think I can get by just fine as a software developer. But there is a solution to this. Count to 3. I'm not kidding. Count to 3. Take a real, actual deep breath when you're looking at an error message that looks like gobbledygook or literally in a different language, and then read it. Actually read the error message out loud, because oftentimes it will tell you the character on the line of where your error is, and oftentimes it's just misspelling else, or you misspelled guard, or you misspelled some other keyword in Swift, and all you have to do is fix that error. Oftentimes I found myself laughing at myself after the fact, because that's all the error was I misspelled something. But you get all worked up because you're so used to Xcode saying, oh, we'll fix it for you, we'll do all this stuff for you. So what that taught me is that Xcode's actually pretty good. And the developers that work on it, not only, I think we all agree, they work super, super hard, and having to work for the spaceship is a difficult endeavor no matter what, but they work really hard on their tool. And not allowing myself to use their tool for a month gave me, I think, a deeper appreciation for it, because of the things that it, I think, lets you either get away with, or the things that it simplifies for you. Because once you start to dive into some of the things underneath the hood, you start to understand what Xcode really does for you. Because everything, all 3 of those demos can all be done in one environment with Xcode. There's no reason that it can't. But we had to show you the multitude of tools that are available to you now, and the important thing about that is it should be focused on because it moves the needle. As we've talked about, we've often seen things where the Xcode team will, like for instance, they Sherlocked the package management system because they talked about Alcatraz. Who here used Alcatraz when it was available? Yeah, I loved Alcatraz. I had Xcode modded beyond recognition, and then one day they were like, guess what? We have text editing packages that you can install now, and it's, for me, it stunk. But at the same time, they Sherlock this because they see that other developers are contributing to this, and they see what developers want. So being able to work on this third-party tooling and being able to actually get involved with it shows the team what developers really want. So it's important to try this stuff. It's important to push yourself to move the needle, and it means that we win and we have the power at our fingertips. This is the slide you want to take a picture of, as I have said in the title of it, so you might want to get your phones out and take a picture of this. Because of the amount of memes in this slide, I may not post these slides on the internet, I'm not sure yet. And if you haven't seen my Twitter address in the bottom, if you're watching on Twitch, hi, my Twitter address is right above this. But my Twitter address is in the bottom right-hand corner if you're sitting here in the room with me. You can follow me there, and I might just post the slides on my SlideShare deck, and you can see them there. I'll leave this up while we go, but, and by the way, one more thing before I take questions. The middle one there, that is an explanation of all of the arguments you can pass into a package in Swift Package Manager, and that shows you what the proper syntax is. So up to next minor, up to next major, exact. If you want to specify a commit hash, that is your guide for how that syntax actually needs to be formed. I found this Sunday, and I almost jumped out of my chair when I found it. So I recommend taking a look at that. But with that, thank you for listening. Does anyone have any questions?
How do you set up VS Code to look like that?
There was an article on NS Hipster that Matt Thompson wrote that shows you how to integrate it. You have to download the source kit for LSP, which is basically, we talked about how language server protocol is basically setting up a language server that adheres to that protocol in terms of having an interface for it. You have to download that source kit and run it separately, so it'll be a consistently running process on your machine. and then you have to download a module into Visual Studio Code that communicates to that server. NS Hipster has an article on that, and I should have added it to this, but if you go to NS Hipster and just search for Swift development in Visual Studio Code, it's a really clear set of instructions on how to set that up on your machine.
What about other than LSP? Anything else you configured for yourself?
I didn't configure anything else for myself because once I got that working, I felt like I was hanging off from the edge of a cliff, and so I wanted to just kind of see what that felt like. I think if I were to ever do this again, I would want to look into what else is there for it, but I don't know. I didn't use anything other than the LSP in terms of getting instant feedback on autocomplete or defining a variable or a function or anything like that. But I would look for that if I did this again, which I don't plan on doing anytime soon.
Yeah, so now that you're back to using Xcode, do you think you'll ever use external tools?
So to repeat this, because I am streaming this, so you're asking me, now that I'm back to using Xcode, would I ever use external tools again? Yes. Visual Studio Code, I plan to continue to use frequently, if not almost exclusively, for Swift on the server development. It's really nice. And the fact that I also do some Node development on the side as well and try to learn other programming languages, like I'm going through a Rust tutorial and I'm able to do Rust development right in Visual Studio Code as well and get really good autocomplete for Rust. Getting used to one environment is kind of nice. Now there's the old saying of don't put all your eggs in one basket, but Visual Studio Code is really quite good. They're doing a lot of good work on it, and I plan to continue to use Visual Studio Code to keep pushing the needle. And interestingly enough, I really tried to get a beta of Swift Studio working for this. Marcin unfortunately couldn't get it working, but he's working real hard on it, and I'm really excited to try that. And Katura Studio, I'll be doing some demos of that, for the job and see how that works. Any other questions? All right, well, enjoy our President's State of the Union, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.